Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk called Designing for Cognitive Disabilities. I'm super excited to be here with you at DesignX Remote Design Week. I still remember the last Remote Design Week, which was a year ago, but it feels like so much longer. Super excited to be here and sharing some things I've learned with you all. Just before we get started, just a little bit about me. So my name is Tolu. I'm a product designer based in Toronto. Have a background in front-end web development, and I'm really passionate about inclusive and accessible design. I'm a little bit obsessed with plants, which you might be able to tell from my background. I recently started to learn to play tennis, like a new COVID hobby, and I'm super, super fascinated by anything having to do with space, like the universe, the future, planets, all that stuff is really fascinating to me. Yeah, so that's me in a nutshell. And now we're going to jump into my talk about designing for cognitive disabilities. So today we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about what a cognitive disability is. We're going to talk about using simple language. We're going to talk about reducing cognitive load, using simple layouts, and testing with a variety of users, and how all those things can positively impact the products that you create. So first of all, what is a cognitive disability? Cognitive disability is a really nebulous term that we use to describe a variety of conditions that might impair brain function and executive functions. So this can look like a whole range of things. It can look like ADHD. It can look like an autism spectrum disorder. It can look like dementia. And it can look like brain fog. The important thing to kind of keep in mind is that cognitive disabilities can look really different depending on who you're talking to, and the best person to describe if someone is dealing with a cognitive disability is the person themselves. So, before we get started, I'm going to define a few terms that'll kind of be important in our conversation about designing for cognitive disabilities. So, neurotypical. Neurotypical is a word that describes people who do not have a cognitive disability. These are people whose brains function in a way that's determined by our society to be normal. Neurodivergent. So neurodivergent people are people whose brains functions in ways considered atypical by society. That again could look like someone with ADHD who can deal with things like sensory overload or a lack of focus. Neurodivergent kind of is a catch-all phrase for all these different conditions that can affect the brain that make the person kind of experience life in a slightly different way and process information differently. So, by and large, people who have cognitive disabilities have difficulties with mental tasks that a neurotypical person might not struggle with. So we're also going to talk about WCAG for a second. So WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are defined by W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, which maintains web standards around the world. So what's important to remember is that WCAG are kind of the guidelines that we use to make sure the things that we create are accessible. It's a little bit like a checklist of things that you need to do in order to meet basic accessibility standards. It's really important to realize, though, that this checklist of sorts is a starting point. Doing every single thing on this checklist won't necessarily make your product accessible. It's really important to keep with the spirit of accessibility and be aware that pivoting solutions slightly depending on context is really important to make sure whatever you're working on is accessible. And the World Wide Web Consortium releases these web content accessibility guidelines and periodically updates them to meet kind of developing trends in the web world and making sure that these standards are up to date. So, cognitive disabilities are actually the most common disabilities on the planet. It's pretty wild to think of, but over 1 billion people on this planet have cognitive disabilities out of nearing 8 billion people on this planet. So that's a huge chunk of people. And keeping this number in mind, I think, is really important because we tend to think of accessibility as something that's niche or for a small group of people. But no, like a huge chunk of our planet are people with disabilities. And so we very much need to keep in mind that accessibility solutions are solutions that affect a lot of people. They're not niche, they're not small, and they're definitely not requirements that should come at the end of your process. Accessibility considerations should happen from the very early stages. I see this happening a lot in the real world right now, but groups tend to think that accessibility is a feature that they can add after launch, but accessibility is not a feature. Accessibility is a priority, and it's part of basic functionality of any app or design that you release. So, WCAG when it comes to cognitive disabilities. So, as you can imagine, sometimes it's difficult to quantify things that we can do to make our content products more accessible to people with cognitive disabilities. For example, what is accessible language? And a lot of these guidelines are generally AAA, but with the newest version of WCAG, we've seen a few adjustments to start to address some things that we can do to make our content easier to access for people with cognitive disabilities. One of those things, a guideline that's recently come into place, is line spacing, for example. It seems like a pretty simple one, but line spacing can make such a big difference to people who have trouble processing information or processing text. It makes it a lot more readable. So now line height and text spacing are baked into a CAG guidelines, which is a great step forward to making sure that content is more accessible to a wider range of people. Language. So first we're going to discuss how to make things accessible in the realm of language. So one thing that we can do to make our content more accessible has to do with descriptive page titles, for example. So when you have a page title, both on the page itself and in the tab aspect of the content, you need to make sure that the actual text describes what's on the page. So a great example of this is what is shown on tabs when you're browsing in Google Chrome or Safari or Firefox. So this page, for example, uses the title button Shopify Polaris. Now, this is super helpful because the first thing you see in the page title is button, and then reference to the larger material that it's part of, which is Shopify Polaris. This is helpful because at a glance or skimming through content, the user is able to see the primary thing that the page holds, as opposed to if we had Shopify Polaris dash button. That means that the user would have to read the entire page title before they knew what the page was about. So it's really helpful to format things in a way that first shows the main content of the page and secondarily shows kind of the parent website that the content is a part of. Simple language. Now, simple language can be a bit of a challenging one because how do you quantify simple language? So sometimes language is inherently complex and just difficult. They're just difficult concepts to explain. A great example of this is a mortgage calculator, for example. Some terms are inherently difficult to understand for people who are not part of the mortgage industry. Terms like amortization period, terms like gross annual income, and terms in that realm. So, how do you create an accessible experience when you have inherently inaccessible language that's kind of inaccessible by design, actually, to make mortgages more exclusive, kind of more wealthy people have access to mortgages, and you can definitely see that this process is tailored towards perhaps those people. So a great way to do this is to include descriptions right on the page. If it's a very complex idea, don't make your users have to leave your page in order to get a good understanding of what you're talking about. Include a description on the page or include a way to help your users access that information. Cognitive load. So cognitive load is a big one. It's definitely a big part of designing for people with cognitive disabilities because we want to reduce the amount of brain power of active resources someone has to use to interact with your design. I like to think that the best designs are the ones that are kind of not noticeable. If someone is noticing the patterns you're using or kind of hyperfixating on the format or the layout, that probably means it's pretty obtrusive. Like it's something that they have to think really hard about to operate. So I think our goals as designers, as developers, should be really to create an experience that a person comes out of and doesn't think twice about. So yeah, cognitive load is the amount of working memory and short-term memory someone is using in order to interact with something. So, a really good example of forcing your user to use a high amount of cognitive load is the Facebook login page, for example. So, the Facebook login page features text boxes to enter information like your email or phone number or password that don't have a label. They actually use this really light colored placeholder text to prompt you as to what to handle, which looks great on the surface, but as soon as a user starts to enter their email address, for example, the placeholder text disappears, and it's really easy to forget what the field was even called in the first place, what information you're supposed to be entering. And that results in users, I know I do this, having to delete the information that they entered in order to see the placeholder text again so they can remember what the field is actually for. Now, this is a pretty like a pretty jarring experience. It's not great to get halfway through a form and realize you don't even remember what you were supposed to be entering. And you have to actually delete the information and re enter it, which is a lot of work for the user and not really an ideal experience. So, a great example of reducing cognitive load is making sure that your fields are labeled properly so your user can quickly get access to the purpose of that field and they're able to continue on with entering their information without much effort on their part. Another example of cognitive load is giving users feedback in queues. So a great example of this, for example, is the disabled button. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about disabled buttons, and anyone who knows me will know that I could talk about them for days. But one issue with disabled buttons is that they provide no cues and feedback to users as to why the interaction is not working. So I'm sure we've all experienced a situation where we're entering content into a page and all of a sudden we get to the bottom of the page and want to proceed to the next stage, but the button is disabled. You click on it, nothing happens, and there's no way for you to find out in some of these situations what's actually wrong with the content that you've entered. So that's a pretty frustrating experience for users, but it also adds a lot of cognitive load to the interaction because the user has to sit down and really think about what they've done wrong, potentially go over all the data they've entered again, and that's just not fun for anyone. So if for example a disabled button is something that makes sense in a certain situation, I can guarantee you actually most of the time a disabled button is not needed. You can instead use an active button that when a user selects it, they're then met with error messages explaining what they did wrong. But one situation I can think of in which a disabled button is actually helpful is, for example, when you're trying to purchase something on a website and there's no more of that item. So in that situation, there's no error on the user's part. So an active button wouldn't make sense, but they cannot add that item to a cart and they need to know why. So instead of just disabling the button and leaving it at that, a great option is to actually have the button present. And then when a user tries to select it, give them some feedback on why it's not selectable. So in this example, the user is not able to purchase a ticket because there are none left and they have to add between 1 and 9 tickets. So this is something to keep in mind. Basically, 99% of the time, you probably don't need a disabled button. But if you really do, in a situation like this, where an item is sold out and the user cannot add it to their cart, it's great to present some information to the user as to why that action is not possible, to reduce cognitive load and to reduce the amount of time the user has to spend wondering why the interaction is not working. So, allowing users to cut, copy, and paste is a really big one. I think that this is often omitted actually as an accident as opposed to being a feature, but it's really important that we maintain the ability for users to cut, copy, and paste information. I've seen some applications that are meant to be secure, such as banking apps, not allowing users to cut, copy, and paste information, but this is actually not very inclusive, and it's a huge problem for people who may have memory issues or a difficult time holding things in their short-term memory. So cutting, copying, and pasting allows users to bring data over into different applications without having to think about it too much. When we eliminate the ability for users to cut, copy, and paste, we're actually creating a situation that's not great for the user, but most of the time it doesn't really make sense. If a application is not letting a user cut, copy, and paste for security reasons, what's most likely going to happen is that the user is perhaps going to write the password on a page because they can't cut, copy, and paste it somewhere else, or they can't cut a password and bring it into the application. We have great apps like 1Password that store passwords through letting users copy and paste them into applications. When you disable that, we're creating a situation that's not very accessible and that excludes people who aren't able to memorize pieces of information very easily. Another thing we can do to reduce cognitive load is not forcing users to do unnecessary tasks, especially those involving memorization. So, a great example is when you sign up for an app and they require a verification code from your text messages. Now, some apps do this and then they send you a super long verification code that's really difficult to remember, which is pretty unnecessary. To make it even worse, some apps also make it impossible to copy and paste information from your text messages into the text validator. Now, that's a pretty awful experience. If someone isn't able to memorize information easily, that creates a pretty awful situation for them where they might have to switch between applications back and forth, entering numbers incrementally, which is not great. We have the technology to pull information from text messages and automatically verify it in app to make sure that the codes are accurate. And I think whenever possible, we should account for situations like this, making it as easy as possible for the user to make it through your flow and minimizing unnecessary tasks like manually bringing over numbers from a text message into a phone app. There's absolutely no reason why copy and paste shouldn't be available here, if not reading the text, reading the verification code automatically and automatically verifying the app for the user. Another situation we can talk about when it comes to reducing cognitive load for users is to avoid infinite scrolling and automatic page refresh. So when we're scrolling through apps, for example, having infinite scroll is a really addictive usage pattern, and it's not a great situation for people who might have trouble with attention or kind of self-regulation. So it can kind of lead to a situation where users are doom scrolling for ages, for hours, and actually getting addicted in a sense to this interface because there's constantly new information to see. A better alternative to this allows users to kind of manage how much information that they see at once, which can be done through pagination or even a load more CTA, which then shows the number of pages of content remaining. I think it's a much more honest kind of interaction to let your users know what's going on, how much content there is left, then try to suck them in with this dark UX pattern of not letting them know how much content there is and letting them potentially scroll through content for hours, even if that content is recycled or repetitive. So, cognitive load, in a nutshell, is kind of calling us to use common patterns in existing mental models. There is no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to design. Everything has already been done before, and it's a great thing to be able to draw from those previous kind of designs and then bring them forward. There's no reason to recreate processes that are already well known and well used by users. It's unnecessary and it's just not great to have to relearn how to do things when you open an app. It's much more beneficial to draw on common design patterns and then use them to your benefit. Allow users to kind of come into your app able to already know what they're doing because they're recognizing common design patterns already. We also want to make sure that we're using accessible visuals and videos to support content. I think there's a common misconception that it's inaccessible to use visuals and video, and that's just not true. Of course, text will by and large always be the most accessible form of content just because it can be read by screen readers, it can be changed into a braille format, but visuals and video can be really helpful to help support content. They definitely shouldn't live on a page by themselves with no context, but they can help you further explain or emphasize certain concepts as long as they're kind of used in an accessible way. So for visuals, that means having alternative text attributes which describe contextually what is being presented. And for video, that includes having captions as well as transcripts when necessary. Labeling your icons. So this is a big one. On this page, I have images of lot descriptions, or like images of little icons that you would see on the tag of clothing that you purchase, which tell you how to take care of the clothing. So these icons to the average person are completely not understandable without any context. Like seeing an image of a box with a black circle in the middle underlined means absolutely nothing to me without context. Now, if I worked in the clothing industry, this might mean something, but to me, a layperson, it means absolutely nothing. But we can kind of look at the associated text and get a much better idea of what the icon actually means. So icons can be a great way to support and convey content, but having text makes them understandable to many more people. So that black box I was talking about with a black circle in the middle underlined actually means tumble dry, permanent press, no heat in the world of laundering clothing. A great example is looking at kind of icons and trying to understand what they mean without text. So to me, um, a heart icon that's green doesn't mean much without text. But when I see it contextually, I can understand that it means favorites. So labeling your icons, no matter how straightforward you think the meaning might be, it is just super helpful. You don't have a situation where people are guessing or unsure, and you also have the added benefit of adding context for users who might not be from your culture. A lot of icons we use are actually very deeply embedded in our culture and common knowledge we share with other people, which doesn't translate well for people who are not from the country, not from your culture, or who live internationally if your product is being used in multiple markets. Adding labels makes it a lot more accessible for people and allows them to understand what icons mean without needing contextual knowledge from your culture. Layouts. So, when it comes to layouts and designing for cognitive disabilities, there are a few things we can do to make our content more easily accessible. We can use white space liberally, which means on the page, not crowding content closely together, leaving white space and recognizing that white space is a design tool. It is a great thing when you know how to use white space properly. You're able to properly space out content, you're able to emphasize certain content, de emphasize certain concepts. But overall, I would recommend warming up to white space and realizing that it does have a place in design, and it can be a really helpful tool to help chunk content and emphasize what message you're trying to get across. I would also recommend dividing complex tasks into shorter, easier steps. Now, this isn't always necessary in the case of a login page, for example. I don't think there's usually a good reason for having email, like entering your email on one page, than having enter password as a second step. But for more complex interactions, I think it can definitely be helpful to divide things into more bite sized pieces so that users can kind of attend to different aspects of the journey separately. A great example of this is Wealthsimple. So when you're signing up for Wealthsimple investment products, you will have an experience that's kind of fragmented with progressive disclosure. Investing itself is a very intimidating concept for most people. It's this kind of black box with all these weird acronyms: RSP, RSP, TFSA. A lot of people off the top of their head don't know what those things mean. So having this whole process kind of fragmented into steps helps users get a full understanding of each step before moving along, which is pretty important if you want people to give you their money to invest with. So when it comes to getting set up, for example, Wealthsimple has uh, a description of each of the different steps, as well as an indicator of which step you are on, and the total number of steps, so you know how far along you are in the process. This is super helpful for users to have a full view of all the things that they need to do, all the information that they need to get ready, as well as how long they might expect to be continuing on this whole track. Um, The individual steps are presented with a blurb of information, why this information is being asked for, which is helpful for getting trust from users when you're asking them to invest money, and then allowing them to continue along the process once they've been presented with kind of the purpose of that stage and what they should expect to share. Testing. So, testing is a huge part of making sure that you're designing properly for people with cognitive disabilities. It's great to test with a variety of users, including those who are neurodivergent. So, testing with a variety of users is important to get a variety of perspectives. But I think it's important to remember that a lot of companies, the application process even screens out a lot of people with disabilities. A lot of the time, job application forms are not even accessible. So, of course, users with people with disabilities are excluded even from the get-go of that process from even being able to apply for jobs. So, testing within your own company, unless you've actively made it a priority to hire people with disabilities, will not always yield the most accurate results as to whether content is accessible or not. So, I would encourage everyone here who works at a company to look into how accessible your hiring process is to make sure that you're including people with disabilities even in your workforce, but then also be open to testing outside of your company and pulling in people with disabilities who are experts on how to use various types of software to access your content. They'll be able to tell you the best whether or not your content is accessible. Hire neurodivergent people. So I just spoke to that a bit, but the best way to make sure that the things that you're designing are accessible is to have people with disabilities working on them from the very early stages. So yeah, look at your hiring process. That's probably the bottleneck for why you don't have people with disabilities represented at your company. Creating more inclusive designs. So it's important because it's the right thing to do. Um, as as developers, as designers, we really do have a responsibility to make sure that the content we're putting out there, the things that we're putting out there, are actually usable. Your work will reach more people if you make more inclusive designs. Even just from a business perspective, it's not a really smart business decision to exclude 1 billion people from your products. It's not very smart to kind of push aside a huge group of people who could potentially be interacting with what you create. And yeah, it's our job to create more inclusive designs. Um, if there's one thing I would like to take you to take away from this talk is that creating more inclusive design is a part of your job description. Your job description is not just to create products for a certain group of people. You are meant to create products that anyone who's interested can interact with. And if you are looking for ways to improve at this, for help to improve your processes internally, there are really awesome resources out there. For example, Fable Tech Labs does a really great job of pulling in people with disabilities to help companies test their content and make sure that it's accessible up to a certain standard. I would encourage you to look into resources that can help you improve because most likely you will need to level up your knowledge in order to make this a priority and to make it a main part of your offerings. And I highly encourage you to do that. So, in summary, today we've talked about what cognitive disabilities are. We talked about using simple language, reducing cognitive load, using simple layouts, and testing with a variety of users, including users who are disabled and have cognitive disabilities or other disabilities. Um, Thank you so much for joining me today in this talk. I've really enjoyed sharing my findings with you. And somewhere on this page, there should be a box for you to leave comments, your thoughts. I would love to hear from you, hear your feedback, your own experiences, and anything that you'd love to add to the conversation. If you'd like to reach me, the best way to reach me is on Twitter, and my handle is at Tolu_XYZ. Thanks again for tuning into my talk about designing for cognitive disabilities.